Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
He drove me to Clara's house at 1 in the morning. Didn't say a word for the first 15 minutes of that ride. Just tapped the steering wheel with his thumb like he was counting down to something only he knew about, and I sat there in the passenger seat, trying to convince myself that maybe he was just blowing off steam. Maybe he was only going to yell, scare her, threaten her a little, the way he'd done with other people who crossed lines, as he liked to call it. But deep down I already knew that this time was different because the smell of gasoline in the trunk wasn't a metaphor, and the metal click of that old lighter in his pocket didn't sound like a warning anymore. It sounded like a promise. You ever have one of those moments where you know you could have stopped everything, just one word, one action, and none of it would have happened? But you don't move. You don't speak. You just sit there and wait for it to be over so you can convince yourself you weren't really part of it. That's where I was, and I hate that I didn't scream or run or grab the wheel. I just watched the road and swallowed the panic like I'd been trained to do for years. Troy didn't scream. He never needed to. That's the thing with people like him. He knew exactly how to make you feel like you were choosing the things he forced you into. Clara used to be my person, the one who saw through him long before I ever could. She was the first to tell me, "He doesn't love you, Mara. He owns you." And she was right. But I wasn't ready to hear it back then, so I pulled away, stopped answering her texts, skipped brunches, let her drift out of my life, because it was easier to disappoint her than deal with the wrath I'd face if Troy ever suspected I was starting to think for myself. Clara didn't go quietly, though. She tried, God, she tried to pull me out. She called one night 6 months before the fire and begged me to meet her at a diner. She had notes, printouts, stories from other women who knew Troy. I didn't look at any of it. I just left. She cried in the parking lot, and I didn't even turn back. When Troy found the call log, he didn't yell. He just stared at me and said, "You should tell your friend Clara to stop playing hero. Heroes get punished." And that's when the clock started ticking. On the night of the fire, he made me sit in the car while he walked around back and cut the security cameras. He said it like it was just another chore. "Wait here. I'll take care of the footage." Then he opened the trunk, handed me the red can, and told me to follow him. I did. My legs weren't moving because I wanted to, they were moving because I couldn't remember how not to obey. It's hard to explain unless you've lived it, but when someone like Troy gets into your head, there's a part of you that stops asking why and just does what keeps the danger at a distance. He poured the gasoline across the porch, then down the front steps. He was so calm. It was terrifying how calm he was. When he handed me the lighter, he didn't ask me to light it. He just wrapped his hand around mine, forced my thumb down on the wheel until it sparked. I didn't light it, but I didn't stop him either. That was enough. That was all he needed. One spark. He did it himself, but my hand was part of it, and that's the part that haunted me for years. The fire was fast. Clara wasn't home, thank God, but everything she owned, every photo, every letter, every piece of her life gone. She left town a week later and never came back. She didn't know I was there. I never told her. I told no one. And Troy made sure I never would. The next morning, he made me breakfast like it was just another day. Eggs, toast, coffee the way I liked it. He even kissed my forehead and said, "See? You get it now. That's love, Mara. That's loyalty. You chose me. That night proves it. And you'll always choose me." And I believed it. Not because I wanted to. Because I didn't see another way. Because when someone makes you feel like the only path forward is the one they paved in fear, you stop looking for exits. But I never forgot the sound of that lighter. And I never forgot Clara's voice when she told me, "One day, you're gonna hate yourself for standing next to him." I did. For years. So let me ask you something. If someone you loved made you part of something unforgivable, not in words, but in silence, in fear, in manipulation, how long would it take you to come clean? Would you ever? Or would you carry it like I did, pretending it wasn't your fault, until one day you look in the mirror and realize your silence burned just as much as the fire? Because for me, it took 8 years. 8 years of pretending. 8 years of planning. And when I finally opened my mouth in court yesterday, Troy didn't smirk like he used to. He hit the floor. Not because of what I said, but because of what I finally admitted. But we're not there yet. You need to know what came next. You need to understand what kind of man Troy really was. Because fire was just his warm-up act. There's this thing that happens when you live under someone's control for long enough. You stop asking whether you're okay and start asking whether they're okay, because their mood becomes the weather. And you just try to dress for the storm without daring to check the sky for yourself, and that's what my life became after the fire. Not because Troy got worse, but because I became smaller, quieter, more calculated in the way I moved through the house, through my own mind, and through every interaction that might accidentally remind him I used to have opinions of my own. After Clara's house burned and she disappeared, Troy was different, not in a loud or violent way, but in that smug, settled kind of way that men like him get when they believe they've finally cemented their dominance. Like there's no more need to prove anything because you've already demonstrated that there is no line you won't cross and no one around you brave enough to draw a new one. He started calling me partner more often, and not in the loving way you might call your spouse when you're building something together, no. He said it the way a CEO refers to a junior employee who has no stake in the business, but every ounce of responsibility for its collapse if something goes wrong. He started letting me in on things, not the truth of what he was doing, but just enough to keep me wrapped in the illusion that I had influence, like when he showed me how he managed to get a man from the neighborhood to donate a plot of land by threatening to expose an affair he probably never even had, or when he convinced a struggling mechanic to sign over part ownership of a shop in exchange for a loan he never intended to collect on. Troy didn't need money, he needed leverage, and he needed people to know, without a shadow of a doubt, that saying no to him came with costs they weren't ready to pay. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I stopped recognizing myself. I didn't speak much anymore, except when spoken to, and even then, I measured every word like it might be the one that tipped the scale from safe to dangerous. I walked softer, breathed quieter, smiled when I was supposed to, and stayed still when I wasn't. It didn't happen overnight. It happened by degrees, like boiling a frog, slow and subtle, until the heat is unbearable and there's no strength left to jump out. I stopped seeing friends, because the ones who remained after Clara vanished started to look at me with either pity or suspicion, and I couldn't stomach either. I stopped visiting my parents, because they asked too many questions I couldn't answer without breaking down. I stopped reading books that made me think, stopped watching shows that reminded me of who I used to be, and eventually, I stopped writing, not because I didn't want to, but because the words that used to pour out of me now felt dangerous, like evidence. Like confessions I couldn't afford to leave lying around. But the silence wasn't empty, it was building something inside me. Something slow and deliberate and sharp-edged. I didn't realize it at first, but my mind had started collecting things, not memories, not stories, but patterns. Troy wasn't as unpredictable as he wanted people to believe. He had tells, habits, triggers. And once I started recognizing them, I started writing them down, not in journals or notebooks, but in my head, rehearsed and filed away like a lawyer building a case long before a court date was even possible. I remember the night it shifted, the night I stopped feeling like a victim and started becoming something else. Troy had just gotten off the phone with a man from out of state, someone I didn't know, but from the way he paced and the clipped way he said, "You're making this harder than it has to be," I knew it was another Mark. Another scared soul who owed him something and didn't want to give it up. He hung up, looked at me, and said, "Some people only learn through pressure. The trick is knowing just how much to apply before they break." That night, I went to bed with my eyes wide open, not from fear, but from the realization that he wasn't invincible, just practiced. And practice can be unlearned. Habits can be broken. And predators can be cornered. The next day, I made a copy of our shared financial records, just the parts one had access to. I emailed it to myself from the library down the street, then deleted the history. A week later, I took pictures of a drawer full of contracts he'd forced people to sign. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Because I knew what happened to people who acted too soon. You see, Troy didn't hit me. Not once. And, because of that, most people assumed I was safe. that I was just unhappy or lonely or a little controlled, like that wasn't enough to choke a person. But the truth is, there are prisons with bars, and there are prisons where the walls are built out of fear, shame, and the belief that nobody would believe you even if you screamed. And the worst part? He made me feel like I was choosing it. Like I was complicit. Like I liked the power that came with being near him. And for a while, I believed that too. But people like Troy always underestimate the quiet ones. They assume silence means surrender. They don't realize that silence can also mean strategy. And while he thought he was training me to be invisible, what he was really doing was teaching me exactly how to make him blind. And that's when I met Detective Hartman. He wasn't flashy. He didn't come at me with lectures or accusations. He just sat across from me at a community meeting and said, "You're Mara, right? You used to teach at the elementary school. You ever think about going back?" And when I didn't answer, he didn't push. He just said, "What does he need from you?" and walked away. That question haunted me more than anything Troy had ever done. Because once I started thinking about what Troy needed from me, control, silence, obedience, I started thinking about what would happen if I took those things away. And just like that, the ghost he trained started waking up. I didn't start collecting evidence because I believed it would ever lead to justice, or even that it would keep me safe. I started doing it because something inside me finally cracked in a way that didn't make me feel broken, but dangerous in a quiet, methodical sort of way. The kind of dangerous that doesn't scream or strike first, but watches, waits, listens, and remembers every single thing that someone like Troy thinks no one will ever catch, because men like him are never afraid of silence. They depend on it, they feed off it, and they mistake it for weakness every time, which is exactly why I stayed silent, but started watching more closely than I ever had before. The first thing I copied was a simple one-page document, a lease agreement for a piece of commercial property that Troy convinced a local baker to sign over to him under the pretense of helping her pay off her late husband's medical debts. But what struck me wasn't just the predatory nature of the contract, it was the way he left it on the kitchen counter like it was a trophy, something he was proud of, as if the manipulation itself was the real victory, not the property, not the money, but the act of getting someone to sign their dignity away with a smile and a thank you. I snapped a photo of it with my phone while he was in the shower, emailed it to a burner Gmail I created that same day, and deleted the photo from my phone so thoroughly it was like it had never existed. That's how it started, one small piece, then another, and then another after that. It didn't feel like rebellion at first. It felt like inventory, like I was simply taking stock of what I had lost and what I might still be able to take back. But the more I documented, the more I realized how much I'd buried to survive, how many times I'd looked the other way or convinced myself that maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed, that maybe I was the one being dramatic, overly sensitive, ungrateful. That was his favorite word for me, ungrateful. Every time I hesitated, every time I asked even the smallest question, he'd tilt his head, narrow his eyes just slightly, and say, "You're lucky, Mara. Most women don't have it this good. Maybe try being a little more grateful for once." And I'd nod, I'd smile, I'd apologize, and then I'd find myself lying awake at night trying to remember what my own voice used to sound like when it wasn't filtered through fear. Eventually, the file grew beyond photos and documents. I started recording audio, not with some fancy spy gear, just my phone, tucked into my bag or propped up on the windowsill, catching snippets of conversations that most people would have missed or brushed off as normal business talk, but that I knew were full of veiled threats and manipulative bait. He was good at keeping his tone calm, measured, even friendly, but once you knew what to listen for, the pattern was unmistakable. Compliments followed by conditional offers, then a pause, then a quiet warning framed as advice. "You've got potential, Rob, but potential doesn't mean anything if you're stubborn. Just do the smart thing now, and you won't have to worry about consequences later." That was the kind of thing he said almost daily, and everyone nodded along because he wrapped poison in politeness. I categorized everything, had folders within folders, timestamps, transcripts, backup copies sent to cloud drives under fake names, and still, I didn't tell a soul. Because I understood that information doesn't mean power unless you know how and when to use it. I wasn't collecting all this just to get him arrested. I wanted him exposed. I wanted the people who smiled at him in public, who took his handshakes and laughed at his jokes, to see what I had seen, to hear the things he said when no one was supposed to be listening. To finally understand that the man they admired was the same man who once looked me dead in the eye and said, "No one will ever believe you. You stayed, Mara, which means you wanted this." There was one night in particular I'll never forget. I was sitting at the kitchen table after Troy had gone to bed, organizing files, headphones in so I could review an audio clip without waking him. And I stumbled across a recording from 2 weeks earlier that I hadn't listened to yet. In it, he was talking to a woman, Jessie, a new client I barely knew, and he was calm, too calm, as he told her, "You seem nice. And I think you're smart enough to know what happens when nice people don't follow through. I don't want this to get ugly, but you should understand something. When I make a deal, I expect people to remember it. Especially women." I paused the audio, stared at the screen, and felt something inside me shift, not fear, not panic, but a cold, clear certainty that this file I had been building in secret wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. It was about her. And Clara. And the widow with the bakery. And the mechanic with the forged loan papers. And every single person who had looked into Troy's eyes and believed, for even a second, that he could ruin them. Because the truth was he could. He did. But I was about to make sure he never would again. What I didn't expect, though, was that he would start to sense it, not the evidence itself, but the shift in me. One morning over coffee, he looked at me and said, "You've been quiet lately. Not like before. Not soft, just distant." I smiled, played it off, said I'd been tired, distracted, thinking about my parents. But his eyes narrowed, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something flicker across his face that looked almost like suspicion. That's when I knew I had to move faster. I started laying the groundwork for the leak, not the confrontation, not the big courtroom speech, but the quiet, behind-the-scenes release of selected pieces to key people, names I'd collected along the way. People with enough reason to hate him and enough distance to act. I couldn't give them everything yet, that would be reckless. But just enough to stir the pot, to start whispers, to get the cracks forming in the image he'd worked so hard to polish. And through it all, I never told Detective Hartman a single detail. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I wasn't ready. The file wasn't finished. The plan wasn't solid. And I wasn't done becoming the version of myself I would need to be to pull this off. Because this wasn't going to be a rescue story. It wasn't going to be a courtroom drama with a tearful confession and a pat on the back. It was going to be an ambush, a reckoning, a complete dismantling of the narrative he had built around himself, brick by brick, lie by lie, threat by threat, and when it all finally came crashing down, I wanted to be the one standing in the middle of the wreckage, looking him in the eye and reminding him that he taught me how to build fires. But he never taught me how to put them out. And that was going to be his mistake. By the time the subpoenas were issued, and the official investigation had gone from whispered doubts in back offices to public interest stories with headlines that didn't even scratch the surface of what Troy had actually done, I had already been preparing for months, not just with documents and recordings and spreadsheets so meticulously organized they could have passed for legal briefs, but mentally, emotionally, methodically, in the kind of deep internal rewiring that comes from spending years learning how to live in the background of your own life, and then choosing, one slow breath at a time, to step forward with every intention of burning the entire stage down behind you. The investigation didn't begin because of me, and that was exactly how I wanted it. It was Jessie who cracked it open, though she didn't know it at the time, and I didn't push her. I'd seen her walking into Troy's office 3 months before the first legal documents were filed, small folder clutched in her arms, looking like someone who'd been promised a hand up and hadn't yet realized the floor beneath her was already being pulled away. I recognized that look instantly, the quiet, hopeful desperation of someone who still thinks if they just follow the rules, smile at the right time, say thank you and please and don't cause trouble, everything might actually work out. I watched her leave an hour later, eyes blank, phone pressed to her chest like it had just become a grenade. I waited 2 days before slipping the first envelope into her mailbox, no name, no threats, just a copy of one of the voice recordings with Troy's words burned onto the bottom of the CD. Just do the smart thing. That was all. From there, it moved faster than even I expected. Jessie didn't go to the police. She went to her brother, a lawyer in another county, someone with connections, someone whose own family had once been caught in a similar trap and never forgot the scars. I stayed in the shadows and kept feeding them what they needed. Every week, another envelope. Every file designed to answer the next question before they asked it. Troy never suspected me, not really. By then, he'd convinced himself that I had been fully broken, fully reformed into his version of a loyal wife, someone who would never dare rise against him because I had too much to lose. And I let him think that. I played the part better than I ever had, nodding at the right moments, smiling through clenched teeth, offering comfort when he felt pressure building around him, listening while he speculated about who might be behind the leaks and carefully steering him toward names that kept his attention off of me. The trial didn't feel real at first. When the date was set and the courtroom was chosen and the press started gathering outside our front door like vultures sensing death in the air, I kept waiting for the moment I'd wake up back in the house, back in the kitchen, back in that suffocating loop of control and gaslight and guilt, but it never came. Instead, I found myself sitting in a waiting room outside a courtroom, watching the man who had once held my hand to a lighter and told me we were in this together pace nervously in a suit that didn't quite fit anymore. The weight loss had come from stress, not guilt, not remorse, just the constant gnawing pressure of a reality he no longer controlled. Clara came back on the second day of the trial. I didn't know she would. She walked in during a recess, wearing a look I couldn't read, carrying nothing, saying nothing, just choosing a seat 2 rows behind me and sitting down like she belonged there. Like she had been waiting 8 years for this moment and didn't need to say a single word to make it known. I didn't turn around. I didn't speak to her. I didn't cry. But I felt her presence like a hand on my back, steady, cold, and immovable, as if to remind me that not all of the damage Troy caused was invisible, and not all of the people he hurt disappeared. Some came back to watch. Witness after witness took the stand, small-town business owners, desperate single mothers, retirees who'd been talked out of pensions and convinced to invest in fake ventures that never even made it to paper. Each of them had a story, and while none of them were as dramatic or cinematic as the fire or the blackmail, they added weight to the file I'd been building in silence. The prosecution laid it out piece by piece, careful not to overwhelm the jury too soon, and I sat there with my hands folded, waiting for the moment I'd be called, the moment I'd stop being a background character in his story and finally speak in my own voice. That moment came on a Thursday morning. The judge looked at me with a kind of cautious empathy I didn't expect, like she already knew that what I was about to say wasn't just testimony, it was excavation. And as I stood, walked slowly to the witness stand, and sat down across from Troy's attorney, who looked at me with thinly veiled contempt, I realized that I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Not of Troy. Not of the courtroom. Not even of the truth. I was sworn in. The questions began simple at first, laying the groundwork, building the timeline, asking about our marriage, about the business, about the people we associated with. I answered them plainly, directly, without emotion, because I knew what was coming and I didn't want to waste energy performing for anyone. And then came the moment I'd been preparing for, the one I had rehearsed in front of my bathroom mirror, in the car, in bed at night when sleep refused to come, the moment they asked, "Did the defendant ever threaten anyone directly in your presence?" I didn't flinch. I didn't hesitate. I looked straight at Troy, who was staring at me with that same frozen smirk he used to wear when he knew I was lying for him, and I said, yes. He did. Multiple times. And I didn't just hear it. I helped him. I was there. The night he burned Clara's house to the ground, I was in the car, I carried the gasoline, I held the lighter. The courtroom shifted. I heard the breath suck in from the rows behind me. I felt the judge's pen stop moving. I saw the smirk vanish from Troy's face for the first time in a decade. I didn't stop him, I continued, because I didn't know how. Because he made me believe I had no choice. And because I thought if I just stayed quiet, if I just kept being what he needed me to be, maybe he wouldn't do worse. But I was wrong. There were objections. There was chaos. But the jury had heard it. And more importantly, Troy had heard it. I wasn't testifying as a victim. I wasn't begging for sympathy. I was confessing, not because I wanted forgiveness, but because I wanted him to know that the silence he built his kingdom on had finally shattered. And in that moment, as he sat there, pale, lips twitching, his eyes darting from me to his attorney to the jury like he was calculating how far this might go, I realized the victory wasn't going to be the verdict. The verdict would just be paperwork. The real victory was that I had finally said it out loud. I had finally stopped protecting the man who destroyed so many lives while smiling through it. And I wasn't done yet. Because I still had one card left to play, one recording no one had heard, one piece of evidence I hadn't shared with the lawyers or the police or even Detective Hartman, because it wasn't just about proving what Troy did. It was about making sure he heard it played out loud, in court, with everyone listening, while he sat powerless to stop it. And the next day, that's exactly what I did. The final day of the trial didn't begin with fireworks or tension you could cut through with a knife. It began with that strange kind of stillness that only happens when everyone in the room already knows the temperature's about to change. When the people sitting in those uncomfortable wooden benches aren't shifting or whispering anymore, because they've realized that this isn't just another hearing, this isn't just testimony or statements or arguments from lawyers, this is the moment the story either implodes or detonates, and deep down, everyone could feel which way the wind was blowing, even Troy, though he was still doing his best to pretend otherwise, sitting upright with his jaw clenched and his tie too tight, staring straight ahead like he thought if he refused to look sideways, maybe the truth would stay contained to someone else's mouth. I was called back to the stand just after 10 in the morning, and though I'd slept no more than 2 hours the night before, and though my hands were cold enough that I had to clench them together to stop them from shaking, I felt calm, not because the weight had lifted, not because I believed it was over, but because for the first time in 8 long, calculated, excruciating years, I had taken full ownership of what I'd been part of, what I'd watched, what I'd hidden, and now, what I was about to reveal, and that kind of clarity brings its own kind of peace, not the gentle, healing kind, but the ruthless kind, the kind forged in fire and rage and the deep, unrelenting need to put an end to a lie that had stretched on far too long. The prosecution asked if I had anything further to submit to the court, and that was my cue. The moment I reached into the folder I had brought in myself, not something the attorneys had handled or previewed or filtered through legal protocol, but something I had kept close, personal, secret, because it wasn't just a file or a transcript or another piece of evidence. It was the final move in a game I had started playing long before anyone else even knew there was a board. I handed it to the clerk, a small flash drive, and I said, as steadily as I could, "This is a recording from the night of September 3rd, 2 years ago. I recorded it without the defendant's knowledge, and while I understand that brings up legal concerns regarding consent, I believe the content is relevant, admissible under the exceptions for threats of violence and ongoing criminal conduct, and essential for the full understanding of the defendant's intent and pattern of behavior." The judge glanced toward the attorneys, who had clearly not expected this, and Troy, for the first time since the trial began, turned to look directly at me, not with amusement, not with smug condescension, but with a slow, dawning realization that I had done something he never anticipated, that somewhere along the way, I had stopped being a ghost and started becoming a weapon. When the recording began to play, the room was silent. His voice filled the courtroom, steady, confident, relaxed in a way that made my stomach tighten, because I knew that tone too well. It was the one he used when he thought he was invincible, when he believed the person across from him was already broken, already bought, already silenced. "I told her what would happen if she backed out," his voice said, clear and sharp through the speakers. "She thinks she can go crying to the cops, but she won't. She's scared. That's the thing about fear, you give someone just enough of it, and they'll confuse it for loyalty. And if that doesn't work, you burn something close to them. Not them, too obvious. Too messy. You pick something they love. Something that smells like home. Light a match. Watch what happens." The jury stared, some of them pale, others wide-eyed. A woman in the front row pressed her hand to her mouth. The defense attorney tried to object, but the judge waved him off, not because she had made a legal decision yet, but because she wanted to hear the rest. And so did everyone else. The recording continued. "She'll never turn on me," Troy said. "She was there when it happened. That makes her guilty too. And guilty people don't talk. That's the trick, you don't just scare them. You make sure they know they're part of it. You make sure they can't run without taking the fall." And then, the last line, one I had listened to over and over again in the dark, trying to decide whether it was rage or shame that made my hands tremble every time I heard it. "She thinks I don't know what she's doing. But if she ever tries it, if she ever opens her mouth, I'll finish what I started with Clara." It ended there. And for several seconds, no one moved. Then, slowly, the judge turned toward me and asked, "Do you confirm the authenticity of this recording?" And I nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I recorded it myself. In our living room. After he left for the gym, I saved it. Made copies. And I've been waiting for the right time to play it." Troy stood up. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, swaying slightly, hands gripping the table, his face a pale version of the man who used to call himself unstoppable. And then, as the courtroom murmurs rose and people began to realize what they had just heard, what had just been proven, not only about what he'd done, but how he thought, how he operated, how deliberately he'd turned people into pawns and then threatened to destroy them, Troy's knees buckled, and he collapsed right there in front of everyone, hitting the floor like a puppet whose strings had been cut too fast. I didn't move. I didn't look away. I didn't cry. I just sat there, watching, remembering every single time I had woken up from a nightmare drenched in sweat, every time I'd said nothing when someone asked if I was okay, every time I'd replayed that night at Clara's house in my head and wondered what it would take to finally feel like I'd undone even one piece of what he'd done. And then it hit me, I hadn't undone anything. But I had finished it. When they carried him out of the courtroom, I looked back at Clara, who was standing now, her arms crossed, her face unreadable, but her eyes locked on mine like maybe, just maybe. She'd seen enough to know that while forgiveness was never going to be part of the equation, accountability finally was. After the hearing ended, people asked me what I felt, if I felt relief, or justice, or closure, or some kind of peace, but I couldn't give them a clean answer, because the truth was, I didn't feel any of those things, not really. What I felt was something closer to ownership. Ownership of the silence. Ownership of the complicity. Ownership of the pain, yes, but also of the fire. Because it had always been about the fire, the one he started, the one I watched, the one that gutted more than just Clara's house. And now, standing in the ruins of his carefully built world, I finally understood what he meant that night when he whispered, "One spark ends this." He was right. Only he never saw the spark coming from me. And by the time he did, it was too late to put anything out. Not the fire. Not the truth. Not the ending. Because I didn't win with rage. I won with patience. And when he fell not because I fought back, but because I waited until there was no one left to believe his story but him. And now? Now I get to tell mine.